Set like a jewel among Cascade Mountain peaks in southern Oregon, Crater Lake has no equal. Its pure water gives rise to rivers miles from its rim. This rain and snow-filled volcanic caldera is the deepest freshwater lake in North America. That depth is reflected in the cultures that send holy men to gaze at its cobalt blue waters. Depth in time and depth in spirit. A few miles northwest of Crater Lake, the South Umpqua River rises to nurture a rich land and a people we call the Cow Creek Band of the Umpqua Indians. On a map, we see the North and South Umpqua rivers converging to flow to the Pacific Ocean. We also see a convergence of languages. These scattered communities were joined by language and family connections. Cow Creek joins the South Umpqua near today's town of Canyonville. Family bands reunited from seasonal rounds to build their winter villages. Smoked salmon was hung to provide food during wet, chilly winters. Using tools of rock and bone, cedar trees were turned into planks for their houses. The video production Still Standing, the Tribal Nations of Western Oregon, explores the past and present of the Cow Creek Umpqua Band.
The Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians live between the Cascade and Coast Ranges in southwestern Oregon, within the Umpqua and Rogue River watersheds, primarily along the South Umpqua and its main tributary, Cow Creek, for thousands of years. Their homeland was beautiful and resources were abundant.
Big Rocks is located on the winter camp of our people. It was a source of food, not only for fish, but there was the freshwater mussel beds there and mink.
The Cow Creeks made extensive use of huckleberry patches along the Rogue Umpqua Divide. Deer and elk were abundant, as were summer runs of silver salmon and winter runs of steelhead. During the salmon runs, the Cow Creeks built weirs across the streams and placed basket traps made of hazel shoots in narrow channels.
The salmon in great numbers would pass up by the side of the trap, and failing to get above the dam would be carried back into the open end of the trap, and the weight of the water would hold them.
Crater Lake is also a part of a living landscape of the Takelma Indians. The Rogue River rises from west of the deep blue lake and nurtures a culture thousands of years old. It begins as a spring. It quickly becomes a raging river. Cutting channels through volcanic rock, the Rogue squeezes between abrupt cliffs. Then it settles down with placid segments of incredible beauty. It cuts a deeper channel on its way to the Pacific Ocean, and all along this varied course, people are part of this living land. Traditional native storyteller Thomas Doty describes this geography from the eyes of the Takelma, who lived in this region for thousands of years.
We look at our world as the great animal that is the world. And the lifeblood of that world is Kalam, or what we call the Rogue River. It's the lifeblood of that great animal. The head of the great animal is that big round Crater Lake, that big round head up there at the eastern part of our world. The neck of the great animal, what we call Gwyn Targabakdanda, which means literally the nape of the earth, its neck. That's Boundary Springs, where the Rogue River starts up near up near Crater Lake. The ribs of the great animal, the center of the animal, the center of the universe are the two table rocks along the river. And then the rear end of the animal, that's Gold Beach. We call that Daitagayakumada, the rear end of the earth, its tail, and that's where the river flows into the ocean. Now, that's just a part of the story. That's kind of the static picture, but it's also very much alive and moving, like everything in our culture is very much alive. And so we see the lifeblood of the world, we see the river as a symbol of our lives. So up at Boundary Springs, with the river gushes out of the hillside and from 5 different springs, just really fast. It's a full-blown river, and it's like birth. Boom, you're in the world, right? And then like childhood, you are rushing down, that river's rushing down through the canyons out of control like childhood, down through the Rogue River Gorge, down through Takelma Gorge, ripping right along. And then as the river comes into its middle life, where it's going sometimes slow, sometimes fast, going along the, by the table rocks, the middle life of the river. And then as it comes toward the end of its life, as it comes toward the ocean, it kind of slows down and widens out a little bit, like some of us widen out a little bit as we get older, until it flows into the ocean at its death. But that's not the end of the story or the cycle, because out over the ocean, the clouds form that come back over the Cascade Mountains, that brings the rain and the snow, that feed the springs, that feeds the river, that keeps the great cycle of our lives and the cycle of the life of our world, the great animal that is the world, very much alive and in motion.
Other life along the river includes those with 4 legs: the deer, the bear, and the elk. Doty says the bear has special significance to the Takelma.
Bear is very important. We often refer to him as Great Bear in the Sky, and Bear in our mythology is in control of the seasons. We see Bear as the Big Dipper constellation. Also means, Ursa Major, Big Bear, right?
Yeah.
And that constellation circles counterclockwise through the night around the North Star. Well, that's Bear dancing around the fire in his lodge. And as he's dancing around that fire, he is sending the seasons circling through the year. So that when we do our dances down here on the earth, our circle dances, we always dance counterclockwise here locally to honor the Great Bear in the Sky and to help keep the seasons moving through the year.
A large stone at Table Rock represents Bear to the Takelma.
Yeah, Lower Table Rock. It's near the summit of. At one point, as you go up the BLM trail up Lower Table Rock, there's a point toward the top that it's joined by the old time Indian Trail, and they're actually the same trail. And so, as you come up to the summit of the rock, you see this bare rock in the middle of the trail, and so as the seasons would change through the year, we would climb up that rock, up Lower Table Rock, and we would pass the Bear Rock, and we'd pat Bear on his nose lightly, not to wake him up, if it was that time of year, and thank him for the seasons, and then a ceremony would be done on top, a bear dance, always circling counterclockwise. And so the Bear Rock is a physical representation there on Lower Table Rock in the center of our universe.
That universe was alive with boundless beauty, shared by various Native American groups in southern Oregon. The plant life blesses with beauty, but also offers gifts for the people, medicinal herbs as well as food.
Well, traditionally, back in the old times, salmon, the 2 biggest were probably salmon and acorns. Acorns were picked, they were stored for a while, they were eventually pounded into acorn flour, they were leached to get the tannic acids out of the acorns, get rid of that bitter taste. And then you could make bread, you could mix them into a kind of a soup, you could add meat, you could add whatever, and kind of acorn mush, and it's very nutritious. And along with what other animals like deer or the salmon, but also other plants like the camas, yampas, all of these different plants. The women were masters of knowing the wisdom of where to find the food, when to find it, and how it was prepared. And that wisdom passed along through a very matriarchal culture that the Takelmas were for thousands of years, is still passed along today. And so it's the women who carry that knowledge and the stories associated with that knowledge that ensured that there would always be plenty of food for the native people.
Janine Moy of Vesper Meadow says camas fields are found at this location, and native people collected the roots here.
The earliest anecdote we have about this place, the headwaters of the creek here that was formerly known as Dead Indian Creek, now known as Latgawa Creek, was from a text written by John Harrington. He interviewed a Latgawa elder around the turn of the century, and Molly Orton, she said, near the headwaters of Dead Indian Creek, there's a favorite camas digging meadow called Tinth. And it's very likely that that is this meadow or this meadow and a neighboring one. So it signifies what you can tell after being on this land for a while, that this is a very important food place, and it has been a very important food place for a long time.
Moy says the indigenous people were active in managing the plants that sustained them.
Really, this landscape pre-settlement, pre-1800s, was very managed. It was just managed by indigenous people in a way that settlers just can't really get our heads around fully.
Thomas Doty explains the Takelma view of the world.
In our old-time mythology and right up until into our current view of the world, everyone is people. Everyone is people. There are the animal people, the four-leggeds. There are the salmon people, who are the swimmers. There are the bird people. There are the rock people. They're the oldest people, and they are the first storytellers. And you can still find their stories carved and painted on the rocks. All of these different people, and the ground people, and the grass people, who are the dancers, and the tree people, the one-leggeds, right? And of course, there are the human people as well. And all of these people are equal in importance to make our world a healthy place. There is no hierarchy that the human people are the most important and the rocks, being not alive, are the least important. Everybody is alive. Everybody has a spirit. This table is alive because somebody made this table, and the energy of that table still exists here with us. And so that's a very critical concept to understand when understanding Native people. And to us Native people, it's not a concept at all, of course. It's a way of life.
The salmon people have a special relationship to the Takelma and their neighbors. Thomas Doty explains.
Back in the old time, back in the myths, we made a deal with the salmon people. They lived in old-time villages at the bottom of the river, and these wonderful villages. And our deal was this. We said, you give us food, and we will ensure that your species not only survives, but thrives. And that gave way to creating the salmon ceremony, which is based on reciprocity, giving back to those who have given us so much. And so a fairly elaborate ceremony established by the Dragonfly brothers and another old-time myth at Tillameek, which is there along the Rogue River outside of Gold Hill. That became the home there at the falls of the sacred salmon ceremony. And it was the only ceremony for a very long time for hundreds of miles around. So people came up from California, they came over from the Klamath Basin, they came up from the coast, down from the Willamette Valley.
They did this ceremony before any of them went fishing. All the tribes come together right here, thousands of them. Every tribe here in Southern Oregon.
The estimate was that at these salmon ceremonies, that there might have been 4,000 to 5,000 Native American coming for these gatherings, because it was a huge trading event. Of course, a huge feast and party, and a chance to see people that you maybe only saw once a year, and arrange weddings or whatever, just a big gathering.
And the salmon ceremony was really important to each year renew that promise we made with the salmon people, to renew that promise, to honor them. The first salmon taken from the river during that ceremony was gutted, put on a drying rack, and then for the length of time it took for that salmon to dry, no more salmon were taken from the river. This might take a few days. And this allowed thousands of salmon to swim past the fishermen, past the village, leap the falls, go upriver to spawn, to ensure there would always be salmon. And while that was going on, of course, we're returning the bones and the skin of the first salmon to the bottom of the river, back to the village of the salmon people to honor them. We're telling stories about the salmon. We're dancing, we're singing to honor the salmon people. And then once that first salmon is dry, then we go fishing. And at the end, we have a great feast of salmon and more stories and more songs and more dancing to honor the salmon.
They wouldn't do a salmon ceremony till one man of the tribe would sit on the story chair in the middle of the Rogue River, upriver from Gold Hill, Oregon. He would sit up there in the story chair and watch the eddy below the rock. They wouldn't catch a salmon until they saw one come in that eddy below the story chair. And when they did, they would all gather and catch salmon, and they do a salmon cookout on the river with them all coming together so peacefully and to share that food.
During the winter, the Takelma gathered in their winter villages, sheltered by plank pit houses.
It's sort of half in the ground, it's slightly subterranean. There's a fire pit inside. There are little ledges around inside for sleeping, for sitting on. And a little hole in the roof for the smoke to go out. You never had to have a very big fire because these plank houses are very snug, being partway in the ground. And the door. Takelmas had doors in their houses. Some of the tribes a little further south, you entered through the smoke hole, and it would be so far down into the ground that the house itself was even covered with earth, and there would be flowers growing out of it. The only sense you would know that there was a house there was there's a little bit of smoke coming up, you know.
Hello, my name is Tawiwi, and my English name is Agnes Baker Pilgrim. As I sit here in front of this pit house that I think is the only one in Oregon, that through a grant that we received in 1999, we were able to build this little pit house here by the Kirbyville Museum. It's a wonderful little replica of what my people lived in hundreds and hundreds of years ago. To sit here now and to speak and be their voice of the ancient ones is quite a pleasure for me. This little house that has a pit inside, build your fire down in the middle and of course towards the top for the smoke hole. And that where you could make a bed around the edges and sleep there. So they could put little shelves in there too for their clothing or for their food.
But the house is the center of the family, the heart of the family, where the village is the heart of the culture. And every Takelma myth begins with the words Willi Yo Wo, which means there was a house, or a house there was. So each of the stories begins at that important center of the house.
Thomas Doty has learned some words and phrases of the Takelma language, a language no longer spoken.
The Takelma language is unique in that it is its own language family. There are no other languages even related to Takelma. The languages around the area include languages from the Hokan family, the Lutamai, the Athabaskan, Algonquin. But Takelma is its own language, and it feels to me, and this is not as a professional linguist, but it just feels to me very old, and that the culture feels very old. And we have characters in the stories like Rock Old Woman. We have a dragonfly who is a culture bringer. Nowhere else do you find that anywhere in the country. Wow. It's just very, very unique in many ways, and yet also very West Coast and Oregon in other ways.
How did this work with all these people living in fairly close proximity and having such different languages?
Well, partly there was a lot of intermarriage between the tribes. Mostly because if you're living in your village, everybody in your village is a little too closely related to you, and you want a lot of branches on your family tree, right?
Right.
And so there was a lot of intermarriage between villages, between tribes. And I use the word tribes in a modern sense. You know, back in the old days, there really were no tribes as we think of tribes today. They were linguistic groups in villages and communities. But that led to a lot of Native people being at least bilingual, if not trilingual. And in addition to knowing the local languages, there was also the Indian Sign Language, which was pretty universal across the country. Used a lot in trading, especially up at places like Celilo Falls up at Columbia, where many, many tribes from different areas, all speaking different languages, would gather. And then, of course, at some point, the Chinook jargon was developed, mostly at the time based on the Chinook language, the mouth of the Columbia River, with only a few, say, Chinook words that everybody learned. But then as the French-Canadian fur trappers came in, a lot of French words were added. Over a period of time with all those gatherings at Celilo, a lot of words from other native languages in the area were added to the Chinook jargon as well. So that was yet another way to communicate between tribes.
Communicating stories happened mostly in the winter, when people were back in winter camp from their seasonal rounds.
People are off to the salmon fishing places, the camas gathering places, or they're going up Huckleberry Mountain to spend several months up there. Another big gathering, kind of like the salmon ceremony, where people came from all over up Huckleberry Mountain to pick the huckleberries. And by the fall, you know, laden with, you know, dried salmon and dried berries and all kinds of different food, the people would return to the winter villages and store away the food, and that would begin the traditional storytelling season that would take us through the winter. Well, I learned pretty early on that one thing about Native stories is that they do have a lot of levels of truth built into them naturally. Everybody in the village would have come to a storytelling and a traditional storytelling for thousands of years, from the youngest people to the oldest people and everybody in between. And so it was the art of the storyteller, as they're telling the story, to keep all those different levels of meaning alive in the story through the words, through gestures, through movements, facial expressions, and of course in the more dramatic tellings in the winter, even through masks and costumes. And so that no matter who you are right now, where you are in your life, what experiences you've had, you're going to have something you can relate to in the story. This picture that's up currently behind us here, it's a storytelling scene. And the storyteller is gesturing there. And notice that his audience are animal people. There's like this point in the story that the audience becomes so engrossed, connected to the story, that they become participants in the story itself and become the characters of the story. There's that incredible connection between stories and the people who listen to them and the people who tell them.
The culture bringers to the Takelma are the Dragonfly brothers, bringing a duality to Takelma cosmology.
So Dragonfly, or who we call Dal, again, there's the duality. He gets split into two brothers early on in the Dragonfly story. So there's Elder Dal and Younger Dal, the Dragonfly brothers. But even the word in the language, Dal, is a repetition of a single sound. So that duality is even in his name, right? And Dragonfly is sort of trickster and culture bringer all rolled into one. The Dragonfly brothers travel up the Rogue River, changing things, making the world ready for the arrival of the human people. And when they arrive at Tillameek, they establish that as the salmon ceremony place. And when they arrive at the Table Rocks, the place they're going to live their lives, they turn into the two Table Rocks. They arrive at that place, and they become the center of the Takelma world. And Elder Dal being Upper Table Rock, Younger Dal being Lower Table Rock. And so that's basically their story. And so it's really important, the things we learn from the Dragonfly brothers. Elder Dragonfly is the wise half of the trickster character. He's always getting his younger brother out of trouble. His younger brother is always saying, hey, big nose Dal Dal, look at this. You can stay there as a stick in the mud if you want to. I'm going to go do this. And then pretty soon you hear younger Dal Dal call, oh, elder brother, come and help me. You know, it's like.
So they're apt
so,
to be on adventures then.
Right. And so actually once they split into the two dragonflies, those two dragonflies each represent one half of the trickster character, the creator and the fool, the wise man, the buffoon. That split personality is represented in two characters.
Doty says the Rogue River Valley is blessed with many sites that are sacred to the Takelma.
Mount McLaughlin, for instance, is Walamka in our Takelma language. That's kind of the short version. The longer version is, I'd have to look it up. But it literally means the floating mountain. And a long time ago, the mountain was floating around until it found a place to live. And then it settled down onto the crest of the Cascade Mountains and became the home of Acorn Woman, one of the most powerful of the medicine women in our Takelma mythology. And every spring, she comes down the mountain, she spreads her swelling skin over the oak trees to grow the acorns. And in the fall, she goes back to live on her mountain, and her white hair is the shape of the snow on the mountain.
The living world of the Takelma and their neighbors unraveled in astonishingly little time. Historian Ben Truey and archaeologist Mark Tveskoff researched the Rogue River Indian Wars, resulting from changes forced on the people when whites appeared in their country.
So Indian-white contact in the Rogue Valley, current Jackson and Josephine County, starts in 1827 with this guy. This is Peter Ogden. He passed through in 1827 going down the Bear Creek Valley with his entourage. Peter Ogden, his French-Canadian fur trappers, their Indian wives, and then their children. It was a pretty large group, and they didn't have any trouble with the locals.
The initial contact with the European settlers that came into the valley, I think, was peaceful, but as more and more came, they wanted more and more of the resources that were here in this great valley.
This changed when the people were terrorized by an army unit marching through to California. The escalating violence is reflected in official reports of killing Native Americans and destroying their villages and food supplies.
We've been marching about in the mountains, destroying villages, killing all the males we could find, and capturing women and children. And they captured between 30 and 35 Indian women and children. And someone else writes that on the 23rd and 24th of June were spent in breaking up the Indian villages and destroying such war parties as we could find. But by this time, they're not finding any war parties because everyone's in hiding. All the natives are in hiding. This continues until the middle of July of 1851. Around February 9th of 1852, gold is discovered in Jacksonville. And overnight, Jacksonville begins, and we have this small cluster of buildings. And overnight you have maybe as many as 3,000 young testosterone-fueled men, not living in town, but ranging over the entire county, searching for their own, either mining for gold or searching for their own place to mine.
The miners quickly diminished the food supply by hunting deer and elk. Some hunted native people for sport, especially when conditions were not right for mining. One day, miners hung an 8-year-old boy in Jacksonville simply because he was an Indian. When local Indians struck back, panic ensued among the whites, blowing acts of violence way out of proportion.
Then in the very next issue, the Oregon Statesman reports that the Rogue Rivers, Cow Creeks, Grave Creeks, Applegate Creeks, the Umpquas, the Shasta, and the Klamath Indians, and probably the Pitt Rivers, and also the Indians around Klamath Lakes have all united and declared an open and general war against the whites. So it's panic. It's just this is completely unsupported. They just state this, and because this is the rumor they're hearing in Salem, so it must be true. So the Battle of Table Rock actually happens at the headwaters of Evan Creek, and involves maybe 350 to 500 whites by this time, maybe 200 to 250 natives having a pitched battle way up in the hills, lasts about 4 hours. And then the natives realize that Joseph Lane is among the people. And Joseph Lane has a great reputation. He's the only person who actually talks to the Indians. He's treated with them. He's negotiated with them twice before. The cry arrives from the natives, Joe Lane, Joe Lane. And Joseph Lane, firing ceases. Joseph Lane crosses the battle lines, goes to the Indian encampment, and actually talks with them. During this brief truce, the native women go to the creek and carry water to the white people who are dug in on the hillside. The white people who moments before had been trying to kill them. And Joseph Lane negotiates that in a week's time they'll meet at Table Rock, and literally at Table Rock, at the base of the escarpment, and they will sign a treaty. And the upshot is, and at the end of the when this is determined, the Indians help carry the wounded white people 25 miles to Jacksonville. One of the results is that a fort is built in Jackson County. This is what Fort Lane looked like. And notice that there's no stockade around Fort Lane. This is important. This is critical.
And he had built in 1853 Fort Lane, which was the first tangible inscription on the landscape of the Rogue River Valley of the U.S. federal government. And that fort, named after Joseph Lane, who was an early Oregon territorial governor, was located on the south bank of the Rogue River, northwest of the current town of Table Rocks. Here are two quotes from the fort. One is by Lieutenant Jacob Bowman Schweitzer, who was one of these Yankee officers. He was a lieutenant from New York City, found himself on the frontier, and he describes an incident where he says, "A large party of miners had collected in Jacksonville and sent a deputation to Captain Smith saying they would attack the Indians on the Table Rock Reservation. Captain Smith told them he would advise them not to, as the soldiers would protect the Indians as they were placed under the guard of the military by the Indian Department. They said they would whip the soldiers too if they interfered. Captain Smith said, 'Bring it on.'" And that was written in 1855. Captain Smith, at another moment, a year earlier, wrote, he said, "News reached camp that a volunteer company had followed us for the purposes of attacking the Indians. I left camp with 153 Indians and proceeded to the ferry determined to shoot the first white man that would attempt to molest them while under my charge." So that paints a very different picture. At one point, a lynch mob from Wairika came from over the mountain pass to Fort Lane to demand a Native American prisoner from the brig at Fort Lane. And Captain Smith refused, and this citizen militia threatened to take them by force. And I think about those kinds of stories which run so contrary to this sort of popular modern narrative, and think about what that must have been like for these officers at Fort Lane.
Along with Fort Lane, the Indians were allowed to stay on a small reservation near the fort, a source of protection from miners and settlers trying to exterminate them.
And it's a pretty small reservation. You can see it's bordered on the west by Evans Creek, on the right by the Table Rocks, and on the south by Rogue River. And this is Sam's Valley. It's called Sam's Valley because it's presided over by Chief Sam.
Negotiators met with Chief Sam and others, wanting to know why some whites were attacked. Chief Sam told them that the attacks did not come from his people, but the Takelma didn't deny that they were willing to fight.
They had just heard that the whites wished to kill them all, and they thought then their only recourse was to take up arms and fight. It seems perfectly reasonable.
Soon, a white man was killed by a Takelma.
So just like the 1851 war, the the actions of an individual native are attributed to the entire tribe. One native kills some white people, and the result is that a target is painted on the back of every native. And this happens over and over again. It's just 19th century thought. When you're dealing with an inferior, with a savage race, with these people who are not civilized, the actions of any individual are attributed to the entire group, and you chastise. You don't think of individual criminals and trying to track down individuals and punishing individuals. You always punish the group. This is just how things worked in the 19th century, or how they didn't work very well.
Several white people were attacked and killed as they traveled through the Siskiyou Summit, and vigilantes decided to take action against any Indians they could find.
So the white people assemble around the village there, and before it gets light to see what they're doing, they start firing and kill between 30 and 35 natives.
And that started on October 8th, 1855. Lieutenant Schweitzer was awake in his cabin at dawn, and he heard gunfire off in the distance. This is on October 8th, 1855. And that gunfire was a vigilante group from Jacksonville led by a man named James Lupton, who went down to the Rogue River. This is about where Tuvale State Park is today, and attacked 3 Indian villages on the border of the Table Rock Indian Reservation and massacred their inhabitants. Lieutenant Schweitzer was ordered by Captain Smith to ride out to the Lupton to the site, and the pioneers fled at his approach, and they took the surviving Indians back to Fort Lane. And that's a complete inversion of that narrative of the cavalry running to the rescue of the pioneers.
Turns out that the perpetrators of the Siskiyou Massacre are not there, and apparently there aren't very many white young men at all. They're off hunting. So that these 30 to 35 people they kill are old men, women, and children. And there's no exact body count because bodies are seen floating down the river. So that's October 8th, called the Lupton Massacre. And there are 2 white casualties. 2 white men are killed, one of whom just happens to be Major James Lupton. Little ironic justice there. So that's October 8th. October 9th, and to hear the whites tell it, for absolutely no reason at all, the Indians go crazy. All the Indians go on the warpath, and only just 2 or 3 writers, people writing in October of 1855, actually make the connection between the Lupton Massacre and the events of the very next day. So the events of the breakout, which take place the very next day, begin at 2 o'clock in the morning of October 9th, when on the reservation, a man named Mr. Gwynn, William Gwynn, is killed in his cabin. He's awake. He's leaning against the mantle, talking to Clinton Shefflin, and he's killed. He's killed dead. Shefflin gets away. Shefflin is not harmed. The Indians knew in retrospect whose cabin they were burning. They knew the names of the owners of the cabins. They knew the white people a lot better than the white people knew them. And when you get into the details of the breakout, you see that cabins are bypassed, people are bypassed, and every incident of the breakout is different. It's not like they went down the river, killing everybody they could see and burning every cabin they could find. That just didn't happen. It's all very targeted, and it really seems that the best way to avoid any trouble with the Indians is not to cause any trouble for the Indians, to treat them like human beings. But this is treated as a period when all the Indians are on the warpath, ignoring the fact that Chief Sam takes 300 of his people and goes to Fort Lane seeking this protection of the soldiers. They take refuge at Fort Lane. I should have mentioned that in 1853, Fort Lane was built to protect the Indians from the miners, not vice versa. So Chief Sam is taking refuge here, and the story is that all the other Indians are on the warpath. But we know that the only people who are actually killing and burning cabins between the reservation and the Harris cabin are 9 guys, Chief John and 8 of his closest friends. It's just these 9 guys. They're the only hostile Indians at the beginning of October 9th in the breakout. And they continue down the river, and they get to the cabin of a Mr. John K. Jones, who was living just this side of Grants Pass on Jones Creek. And they shoot him in his yard, shoot him. And when his body is found, he's being consumed by his hogs. They also shoot his wife. They shoot her through the lungs. So why was Mr. Jones killed, and why was Mrs. Jones shot repeatedly? Well, J.K. Jones was one of the captains of the Lupton Massacre. He was there. I suspect that this was one of those targeted killings. And I think the people who were at the massacre knew who was massacring them.
In the aftermath of the Lupton Massacre, the Native Americans on the reservation basically took one of 2 approaches. Some trusted to the government and went to Fort Lane for protection against the pioneer lynch mobs. The rest, and these were led by the Indian chiefs John, Limpy, and George, basically decided to fight it out, and they traveled westward down the Oregon-California Trail, following the route of today's I-5, and killed every white person they could find and burned down every cabin they could find. The Battle of Hungry Hill was what happened. The Battle of Hungry Hill was what happened when those dragoons and citizen militias found the hostile encampment of Native Americans in the Grave Creek Hills. And it happened between October 30th and November 1st, 1855. The word of what happened at the Battle of the Hungry Hill reached the settlements of the Willamette Valley a couple days later. And this is a quote from the newspaper at the time, the Oregon Statesman. And this is how people back in the settlements heard about the battle. It said, "The war in the South has become a real and earnest affair. The battle in the Grave Creek Hills has proved most disastrous to our side. It is supposed that there were not more than 100 fighting Indians engaged in the action. The loss on the side of the Indians was very trifling, probably not more than 7 or 8 killed. The Indians had taken a position in the mountains about 15 miles west of the road to Jacksonville, an almost inaccessible place. After 2 days of hardest kind of fighting, the Indians were left in possession of the field. In about 10 days, it is proposed to renew the attack. The exterminators are rather down in the mouth." Those are the people that attacked the Indians on the reservation. "Major Ross was present in command of the Southern Battalion. God only knows when or where this war may end." And that's is a pretty sober assessment of what happened. It was a resounding defeat for the American forces, one of the biggest defeats of the United States Army at the hands of an Indian force in the history of the American West. But what is strange is that compared to other more famous battles, like the Sand Creek Massacre, the Battle of Little Bighorn, the Battle of Hungry Hill, which is in scale a very huge fight. It was like 300 Americans and 100, 200 Native Americans, and it was a major defeat. It's like it's not part of our history, and I was curious why. And the actual location of the battlefield was missing.
The Hungry Hill Battle is a battle the Indians won before losing the war. Reinforcements came in, and Indian fighters eventually surrendered. The Indians of Southern Oregon, even those who sought refuge at Fort Lane, were forced to leave their home in the Rogue River Valley.
In 1856, after the final Rogue River Indian War, the tribes and bands from Table Rock Reservation were marched to the Grand Rod Agency. And during the march, 8 people died and 8 children were born. In 1857, after the Grand Ronde Reservation was created by presidential executive order, most of the Kalapuya, Umpqua, Rogue River, Molalla, and Chasta tribes and bands were removed from their homelands and settled along the Yamhill River on the reservation.
During the period of time that the tribe was removed to the reservation, we suffered great losses in numbers. Losses because of starvation, because of illnesses and diseases that weren't common to Indian people, like smallpox.
Native people are forced from their homelands where they've lived for thousands of years. Here in the Rogue Valley in 1856, there were 5 trails of tears that led out of the valley. Native people force marched up to the Siletz and Grand Ronde reservations up north, only able to carry, take with them what they could carry on their backs. Sometimes families were split into different reservations. And if you want to control a Native people, here's what you do. You rip them out of their homeland where they've been. You split up families. You give them substandard houses so they're always cold. You don't feed them quite enough food, so they're always hungry. You tell them they're going to live in a community. You make all these promises you're going to live in a community, and yet that community is more like a concentration camp than anything else. You force them away from their homeland, where several Native people die from exposure to the elements along those walks. And several other Native people die of sadness. Imagine that. Dying of sadness because you're leaving your homeland. And when you get to the reservations, you're told you have to cut your hair to look like white people and wear white people's clothing, and you will be punished severely if you speak your language or tell your stories. The only reason I think we have some of these stories that survive is in some cases late at night on the reservation, the Native people would gather in the shadows where it's hard to see them. And with quiet voices and with small gestures you couldn't see from a distance, they'd whisper the stories to each other night after night after night, because they knew just how important it was to keep the stories alive, because everything is passed along through the stories. Our history, our folklore, everything we believe in. And it's because of people like that we even have our stories today.
Over those 5 trails of tears, Native people from southern Oregon were moved to the Grand Ronde and Siletz reservations. Those who survived the new life in the very different climate and harsh discipline saw the size of their reservation shrink.
After the people relocated to the 1.1 million coast reservations, many of the articles in the treaty were denied and largely ignored. And within 20 years, 900,000 acres of our original reservation were removed.
Many of the Cow Creek Band escaped capture by hiding in the hills.
When the tribes had to go in hiding, they knew from the folks who were called the exterminators that came in with the particular reason or purpose of killing our people. It's documented in history how the tribes would flee to the mountains. But yet again, they would come back and winter as much as they could in their own campsites.
Chief Jackson from the northern Takelma tribe, which of course is out of Canyonville, they call them the 7 Consolidated Feather Tribe now, because there was a large group of people there when most of the natives in southern Oregon were picked up and taken off to the reservations at Siletz and Grand Ronde, Warm Springs. They were missed. And so Chief Jackson actually was the one who was able to reestablish that reservation and the rights of those people by going to Congress.
In 1953, Congress made termination of the tribes a national policy and called termination a way to free Indians from an oppressive federal administration so that they may manage their own affairs.
And termination for me meant that, as I understood it, that we were no longer the visible ones, we were invisible.
In 1954, 60 tribes in western Oregon from 2 reservations and other rural groups were terminated under the Western Oregon Indians Termination Act. Oregon had the most tribes terminated in any region of the United States. All federal services ended in 1956, and members received $35 for their share of the community land sales. During the post-termination era, Grand Ronde people moved away from the reservation, seeking ways to make a living without federal support. Many families collapsed into poverty, and the tribal community declined, as termination proved to be a failure.
To take back to Congress and say that we needed their help.
On November 18, 1977, the Siletz became the second tribe in the nation and the first in Oregon to regain federal recognition as an Indian tribe after having been terminated by Congress. With the enactment of the Siletz Reservation Act in 1980, the Siletz tribes regained 3,600 acres of their former 1.1 million acre reservation.
Lobbying and a lot of hard work during some pretty tough years without any funds, but it paved the way for the rest of the Oregon tribes, the Western Oregon tribes, to be restored.
It was time for another restoration. The salmon ceremony, welcoming back the salmon on their spawning migration, had not been publicly celebrated in nearly 150 years. That had to change, and Takelma elder Agnes Baker Pilgrim made sure that it did.
Yeah, Grandma Aggie brought the salmon ceremony back in 1990s. We first brought it back to the Applegate River because the land at Tilimic, the traditional land, wasn't available at the time. And the ceremony was done out there for many, many years. And then when this land became available in 2007, we got together and planned out bringing the ceremony back to its original place at Tilimic. And that happened in 2007. And the ceremony was done for a number of years. But we're also looking at trying to put together a ceremony that really addresses the original intentions of the old time ceremony, that really invites the salmon people to come back and to apologize to them for all the stuff that has happened to their species and all the stuff we human beings have done to the river, and to invite them to come back up the river and join us in reciprocity. And if doing this ceremony the next time we do it, no salmon show up, well, that's a teachable moment, right? And we apologize, and then we do a prayer, and we come back the next year, and we do it all over again. If no salmon show up, we come back the next year, and we do it all over again until the salmon people hear us, and they come back as well, and everything is restored. You know, one definition of a hero in mythology is someone who strives against great odds with very little hope of success. And that's what we're going to do, because each gesture, us coming back and saying, we're sorry, we're back, come back and join us. Each gesture becomes a sacred gesture, and each of those small gestures is what changes the world.
It was magic. You hear the sound of the falls. She was singing in Takelma, and there were drums. It was the first time since 1850, when all these people were marched out of here, that the elder of the Takelma made it to that spot.
So I came today to sit in the same place where my father sat, and letting people to know that we are carrying on the culture and the traditions of our people here.
Grandma Aggie saw the Savage Rapids Dam and 2 others removed from the Rogue River. Then, near Table Rock, the Gold Ray Dam, at 100 years old, began removal. There was some drama when the river burst through a cofferdam, isolating this excavator. Now the sacred Table Rocks look down at the free-running Rogue River. Within a year, salmon made their egg-laying reds at the site of the former dam. Grandma Aggie personified the Takelma's deep connection with this river. In southern Oregon, Native Americans have a higher profile these days, taking part in community events like the Salmon Festival in Ashland. Ashland is also the site of a sculpture honoring the Native people who call this area home. Takelma elder Agnes Baker Pilgrim, known affectionately as Grandma Aggie, blessed the sculpture at its dedication, while hundreds of Oregonians joined in the event.
You know, we talk about a lot of the traditional things kind of in the past tense, and I guess that's okay for things we don't do anymore. But one thing that we try not to do is to talk about Native people in the past tense, because we are still here. And here in the valley, there are thousands of Native people now from probably 40 different tribes, and a small part of those are perhaps Takelma or Shasta in the valley here. But we have a word in our Takelma language that kind of dramatizes this, and it's Emetikliak. And it's also the name of the sculpture in downtown Ashland. It means we are here, but it means even more than that. It means we are here, we are living in this place, we are breathing right in front of you. Emetikliak. So we are still here. Right?
No longer restricted from cultural expression, Oregon's Native Americans can celebrate their traditional culture, like this Grand Ronde canoe singing and dance. Another restoration is in some of the native languages that are now taught to the younger generation.
Keeping our language alive is vitally important to us. The terms that we use to describe things in our traditions and in our ceremonial activities can't really be described in the English language the way that they can in the Athabascan language. It really has to do with a way that people look at the world, and that way that our people of Western Oregon have looked at the world for thousands of years is embodied in those languages. So it's vitally important that we keep those alive.
Are we seeing a bit of a renaissance of some of the Native American cultures today?
Yeah, we are. We are seeing that. We are seeing more and more languages come back. So languages we thought were going to be lost forever are now being brought back. Athabascan became kind of the language of choice at the Siletz Reservation, is now being taught at Siletz School. There's classes in conversational Athabascan, and that's happening a lot. And because as the language comes back and the elders begin to talk more and the younger people are listening and very interested in what's going on with their culture, wanting to know more about the culture, we're seeing more and more of the cultural traditions come back as well. So bit by bit, a lot has been lost. Many, many stories that will never be recovered. Some wisdom that may never be recovered as well. But what we do have is coming back, and Native people are embracing their identity as a people who have been here a long time and know how to live here in a healthy way. And from that, we have a lot to learn.
One way of teaching that wisdom was inspired by Takelma elder Grandma Aggie. Writer Tish McFadden tells how she came to write the book Upriver to Morning and had storyteller Thomas Doty and a team of talented helpers develop a full curriculum for Pacific Northwest students.
Well, it started just a tad over 6 years ago. It was March 7th of 2016 that Agnes Baker Pilgrim, fondly known as Grandma Aggie, gave her first book signing for the release of her book, Wake Up World. Grandma says, Wake Up World. It was produced right here in Ashland at Blackstone Publishing. So Bloomsbury Books was packed, just more people in there than I've ever seen for this book signing. And she read a little bit from the book, but mostly she just talked from her heart about the importance of these teachings that she learned as a child and through all the generations before her. And as her line was, she wanted help rippling out her teachings for future generations. Well, it just so happens that I am a published author, I'm a writer, a songwriter, and a former anthropologist and archaeologist. And so that little wish of hers just took seed in my heart that night. And even though I'd met Grandma Aggie back in the 1980s when I first came to Oregon to work on public lands, it was that night that this idea to turn these teachings into a story, because stories are such a great way for people to learn. Stories have been our teaching method music and stories, I would say, forever, for thousands of years.
And the thing is, we've been very, very careful to make sure that everything in this story and everything that comes in with all of the additional materials with this story is authentic, is genuine, is accurate Takelma stuff. And so the thing is, there's not a lot of resources for teachers out there on the Takelma Indians, and the most accurate ones are also the most difficult to get to. Mm-hmm. Some of the least accurate ones are the easily obtainable ones.
But they're not accurate.
Exactly. But no fourth grade teacher is going to spend, 5 hours one night going through, hundreds of pages of John Harrington's handwritten field notes from 1930 to just find the right little thing she's going to mention to her fourth graders the next day. Yeah. But having this Upriver to Morning brings all of these resources together.
Grandma Aggie gave her support and blessing to the project. Tish McFadden brought it into the classroom to see how public school students would respond.
And you are sitting there with a lovely room full of combined classes of second graders or fourth graders. And I did that at Walker School in Ashland, Oregon, and it had a tremendous experience. With the fourth graders, I made 5 visits, and I got to read the story in a very active way, and they seemed to love it a lot. We learned the songs, and we played music, and we moved, and we just had a fantastic time. I wish I could have stayed longer.
McFadden's bond with Grandma Aggie made this project possible and enriched the lives of both. Takelma elder Grandma Aggie attracted a team of loving supporters who saw her through into her 90s. In November of 2019, Agnes Baker Pilgrim, elder, grandmother, founding member of the 13 indigenous grandmothers, and keeper of the salmon ceremony, passed from this world. The indigenous community and many others marked her passing with ceremony and fond memories. The loss was staggering. Much of carrying on her legacy was up to Thomas Doty and supporters from her family and community. In the spring of 2020, Thomas Doty passed away. So in less than a year, the oldest Takelma elder and the teller of traditional Takelma stories passed from this life. Doty passed while seeing hope for the culture he worked his whole life to resurrect, conserve, and share.
I think we're seeing more and more of that happen. We're seeing more of the younger people interested in what the elders have to say. For many years, the elders didn't talk much. Mm-hmm. They said, what's the use? It's obvious the younger people, they'd rather go to the cities, they're not interested in the culture. But now there's much more interest and the elders are talking, and so we're seeing much more of our traditional culture come back, our languages come back as well.
The shape of Crater Lake is round, a circle. Traditional Takelma stories go in circles, always circling back, like the salmon's migration, like the young people listening with rapt attention to the stories of elders. The circle from here, only time will tell. The spirit of Agnes Baker Pilgrim, Tawawi, still lives in Southern Oregon. To see a tribute to Grandma Aggie, visit the website dotycoyote.com-Aggie. To learn more about Grandma Aggie's life and legacy, visit agnesbakerpilgrim.org. For books and audio productions, visit blackstonepublishing.com. To learn more about Upriver to Morning, visit uprivertomorning.com. You'll find links to documentaries, tributes, and interviews, as well as details about Upriver to Morning. Thomas Doty's website contains a vast amount of research on Takelma and Native American culture and language. Visit dotycoyote.com.
You know, it's been my blessing to be able to be a storyteller, and this is my way of giving back, maybe to the next generation of storytellers. Here's all the materials you need. Go with it. Keep the stories alive.